here today on the actual site of the Fort King Road. This behind me is the actual road traveled from Fort Brooke, Tampa, probably about 70 miles south of here, to Fort King, Ocala, probably 50, 60 miles north of here. Essentially, this is right in the middle of that road. In the 1830s, 1834, 1835, Fort King was a very small garrison. Fort Brooke was a little bit larger. It was on Tampa Bay, in the mouth of Tampa Bay. So it would have been an important supply depot, a place for ships to come and bring supplies. This ground is what is now known as the Dade Memorial or Dade Battlefield Park. This is one of the most historically significant pieces of ground in Indian War history. In particular, this is the starting point of the Second Seminole War. We've seen many sites recently regarding the aftermath and some of the battles of the Second Seminole War, but this is where it first started on December 23rd, 1835. Major Dade, at the head of his column of over 100 men, started out from Fort Brooke. On December 28th, in the morning, they were ambushed here by an unknown force of Seminole Indians, led by Micanopy, Alligator, Jumper, Osceola, who was the other prime player in that Second Seminole War, was at that very moment, at the same time these guys were attacking this column. He and his men, party, were attacking Fort King, and he had a personal vendetta against the Indian agent up there. He was apparently a guy who was a piece of work, and he mistreated the Indians. So Thompson was his name. So he got killed right away. As the column was advancing on that morning, it was a cold morning. At that time, this was an open area. The trees, a lot of these trees weren't here. They didn't have outflankers. They didn't have. It was cool. Their coats were buttoned up. They didn't have access to their ammunition boxes. So as soon as the Indians, the first fusillade cut down Major Dade here, and then of course back in those days the leaders didn't, the military leaders didn't hang out in the war room. They were on a horse in front of the column. So that's the front of the column. That's where it started. We're going to go down the Fort King Road. Captain Frazier fell here, second in command. So picture right now, you're walking along, you're a guy in the middle of Florida, middle of nowhere Florida, the absolute positive wilderness, thousands of miles from any kind of semblance of civilization, and you're home, because every one of these guys came from somewhere else, South Carolina, North Carolina, New York, wherever. They were all military guys, real regular military, not militia, not volunteers, regular military guys. So now, within the first shots fired in this battle, you've lost your first two leaders. The other officers was a guy named Mudge, who fell right here. And for some reason, his obelisk monument is gone. It was here the last time I was here. So, out of 108 men that were in this column, more than half of them are dead right now. They got one or two officers left. They got a couple of sergeants. So, they all retreat back over this creek, not over this bridge. It wasn't here then. They would have probably been running through that creek. There probably wouldn't have been a bridge there. If it would have been made out of wood. You go ahead and pause it, please. Retreated back here, and as they were doing so, the Seminoles were reloading for their second volley, second volley. remaining men were breaking out axes, chopping down trees, creating this palisade redoubt. Obviously this is a reproduction, but it's verified historically and archaeologically that this is where it was. So the rest of the men are inside this palisade, this redoubt, which as you can see was nothing. All the other Indians were circled all the way around, firing in. The basic result was that all but 5 of these guys got killed, wiped out. Indians who were interviewed years later expressed their shock and dismay over the fact that the soldiers went to ground. They huddled up. Indian way of fighting was to run. They would have, the opposite would have happened. The Indians would have kept running from now till Christmas. They never would have sat here and got into a situation where they would have been pinned down, because that wasn't the Indian way of fighting. So when the soldiers did this, and the other aspect about Indian warfare was Indians didn't chase. They did not chase for days and days and days. If the soldiers, and this is verified by accounts of not only this tribe but other tribes, if the soldiers would have just kept running backwards, eventually the Indians would have got tired. They would have plundered what was on the ground. And they would have left and considered themselves to have had a success. But because they did go to ground, because they did ford up, the Indians just stayed there and wiped them out. We're going to go in now. We're going to check out the inside of the visitor house, which is it's a font of information. Now we're going to go inside and see the display inside of the museum. You did, but I can do it. This talks about the actual battle. This is a reproduction of Fort Brooke. This shows the map and the timeline. Traversed the Hillsborough twice, the Withlacoochee twice, the Little Withlacoochee. This is where we were camped this past weekend. And this shows a reproduction, obviously from Indian accounts, of the battle. It was all palmetto scrub and open pine field, or pine forest. This is a reproduction of Osceola's attack on Fort King. This is a really neat diorama. I love dioramas. But it shows the Indians waiting. They had been stalking for days, waiting for their opportunity. And this is a reproduction of the redoubt. And by fording up, as you can see, they were just sitting ducks. And they run, they would have lived. After the battle, it was 7 weeks before anyone else got back here. It was only by the grace of God that one or two of the guys got back to let people know that 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 was what had happened, that the massacre had occurred. This is a picture of the graves that were reinterred to St. Augustine, which we've seen. This tells the story of some of the survivors, the only survivors. And the Indian survivors, Micanopy, Jumper, an alligator. And this talks about some of the high points of the Second Seminole War, which raged all over. I mean, all over. Here's where we were a couple weeks ago, the plantations that were burned all along the coast. During the first months of that war, the Indians went nuts. Talks about the Seminole relocation, Third Seminole War, which wasn't much of a war by comparison to this one. Shows you examples of palisades. It's like giant pencils. This is a neat little presentation here. I don't know if it still works or not. Guess it doesn't work anymore. So this shows the position of the first attack. And then they fell back to this position here. And were wiped out. And it shows this whole area was grass, small pine, palmetto, small pines and palmettos on this side. Excellent reproduction. This is a cypress canoe from back in the day. It was discovered in 1864 and believed to be over 125 years old and believed to have been made by white men because of the evidence of white men's tools being used to fashion it. And much more precise tools than the Indians would have had. These were Lieutenant William E. Bassinger's found on his body 54 days after the battle. Wow. This is a French silk kerchief commemorating Lafayette and French Revolutionary heroes. And a money belt and his officer's silk sash. That's incredible. And these are pictures of what the soldiers of that time, the warriors as well, would have been wearing. They're more or less uniform. But you had to be careful back in them days, snake country for sure. And here's a very famous painting that depicts it, the battle. The battle consisted primarily of the redoubt. The action at the redoubt was the quote-unquote battle. What happened before that was the first volley, and it took out the officers. So that's it. That is a brief microcosm of the on the scene, on the same ground action that took place here almost 200 years ago. Very cool stuff.